For the first time, the U.S. Army pushed deep into the vast high plains, charting every mile of Comancheria, mapping the land so they could navigate it when the time came. This was no small endeavor. The territory stretched as far as the state of Ohio, a vast open expanse that had long been ruled by the Comanche. Mackenzie scoured the plains in search of them, but found few, a testament to their unmatched ability to move unseen across the land. The one exception was the battle at North Fork, where he managed to locate and attack a village led by a Comanche chief known as Moway, or Shaking Hand. The assault was brutal. Over 20 Comanche were killed, more than 100 taken prisoner, and about 50 horses seized. In Mackenzie's mind, it was a major victory, the kind of decisive blow that could weaken the Comanche's ability to fight. But he underestimated them. He knew those who had escaped would return for their stolen horses, but he had not yet devised a way to prevent it. When the warriors came, they reclaimed them all. Despite all of his tactical knowledge, despite his understanding of Comanche warfare, Mackenzie had once again been outmatched by the very people he sought to conquer. What had seemed like a crushing victory had, in reality, been a fleeting success, another example of why the Comanche had endured for so long. But Mackenzie was learning. He realized that defeating them in battle was not enough. He needed a strategy that would leave them with nothing to return to. And so, he began shaping a new plan, one that fit his growing reliance on scorched earth tactics, a strategy that would define the war to come. By 1873, Mackenzie's relentless pursuit of the free Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne had escalated into something more than a military campaign. It had become an obsession. No longer satisfied with battling warriors on the open plains, he expanded his hunt, searching for any trace of those who still resisted. His reach stretched beyond the borders of the United States, crossing illegally into Mexico, where he led raids against native communities that had sought refuge beyond American jurisdiction. It was a reckless move, one that could have sparked diplomatic consequences, but Mackenzie was beyond caring. He was chasing ghosts across landscapes that had never belonged to him, determined to crush the last remnants of resistance. But the years of war were taking their toll, not just on the people he hunted, but on Mackenzie himself. The constant pressure, the endless campaigns, the weight of his own brutal legacy had begun to wear him down. Old injuries haunted him, the pain settling into his body as rheumatism, a creeping reminder that no one escapes war unscathed. His temper grew short, his patience thinner than ever. Once a calculating strategist, he was now a man on the edge, threatening his own soldiers with death if they dared disobey him. And yet his brutality was effective. By the end of 1873, the Kiowa and Comanche on the plains were quiet, not because they had surrendered, but because survival itself had become nearly impossible. The sheer presence of the U.S. Army made raiding a dangerous game, one that often ended in relentless pursuit. Every attempt to fight back was met with swift and merciless retaliation. By 1874, the Quahati, one of the last free Comanche bands, were growing desperate. The land that had once sustained them was now a battlefield they could no longer control. Small raids, once the lifeblood of their way of war, were now deadly gambles. Each one came with a cost. Important warriors, leaders among the Kiowa and Comanche, were being lost. The noose was tightening, and they knew it. Soon, they would have to make a choice, fight to the last, or face the reality that the world they had known was slipping away forever. By 1874, the tension on the plains had reached its breaking point. The war had taken its toll, not just on the land, but on the people who called it home. Lone Wolf, the Kiowa chief, had lost his son. Quanah Parker had lost a nephew. These were not just personal tragedies. They were symbolic of a much greater loss, the slow erasure of a way of life that had existed for generations. For them and for many others, there was only one path left: to stand and fight. And Mackenzie knew it. Word reached him that the Comanche were gathering weapons. Desperation was a dangerous thing. It made men reckless, clouded judgment, drove them to decisions they might not otherwise make. He had seen it before, and he was counting on it. More than 2 years had passed since the Battle of Blanco Canyon. The Quahati, once the fiercest and most elusive of the Comanche, had spent much of that time avoiding Mackenzie's forces. But survival through evasion came at a cost. They were disorganized, constantly moving, always running. The pressure was relentless, and the signs of exhaustion were everywhere. The land itself had turned against them. The great herds of buffalo were vanishing, slaughtered by hide hunters who left the plains stripped bare. With every passing season, food became harder to find. The warriors felt it, the women and children felt it, and they knew what it meant. If they were to have any chance, any hope of saving what remained, they would have to unite. They would have to make one last stand. It was a choice made not from strength, but from necessity. A fight for survival, not for victory. Because on the high plains in 1874, the Comanche, the Kiowa, and their allies were running out of time. By 1874, with the Comanche pushed to the edge of survival, a new figure emerged from the plains, claiming to carry the power of the Great Spirit itself. He was Isatai, a medicine man who spoke of visions, of divine gifts bestowed upon him, of pu'a so strong that no bullet could pierce him, no enemy could stand against him. He told the people that he could control the weather, summon endless supplies of ammunition, and even raise the dead. In their time of greatest need, the Comanche had been given a champion, or so he claimed. Faith in power was at the heart of Comanche life. Strength, whether in battle or in spirit, determined the fate of men. If someone possessed puha, and if others believed in it, that belief alone could become a force of its own. But belief is a fragile thing, and desperation makes men listen to voices they might have once ignored. To outsiders, Isatai's promises may sound absurd, but to a people who had spent years in a losing war, it was hope, and hope can make men do impossible things. And so they gathered for war once more, their sights set on an old battlefield. A place where, 10 years earlier, the Comanche had driven off Kit Carson and his soldiers, where their warriors had proven their strength against an invading force. But this time, the enemy was different. No soldiers, no military fortifications, only buffalo hunters, men who had come to strip the land bare, to turn the sacred herds into rotting corpses and ship their hides east for money. To the Comanche, there was no greater crime. These hunters were not just settlers or wanderers. They were the agents of destruction, doing with their rifles what armies could not, starving the Comanche out of existence. The fight against them was not just about land or honor. It was about survival. Isatai, believing himself chosen by the spirits, called for war, and beside him stood Quanah Parker, not a believer in divine magic, but a warrior who did not need faith to know that this was a battle worth fighting. But before they rode to war, Isatai led them in something new, something foreign to their traditions, a sun dance. The Comanche had never performed this ceremony before, borrowing it from other tribes whose faith ran deep in ritual and sacrifice. It was a sign that change had come, that old ways were shifting in the face of desperation, that the Comanche were willing to try anything, even the unfamiliar, to reclaim what was being taken from them. Isatai told them that if they followed him, they would be protected, that victory was certain, that the Great Spirit had willed it. Quanah needed no such promises. He had seen his people hunted, their lands invaded, their future slipping away. Whether Isatai was truly blessed or a fool with dreams, it did not matter. The Quahati would fight because they had no other choice. With war paint on their faces and rage in their hearts, they prepared to ride, ready to face the rifles of the buffalo hunters, ready to reclaim their place in the land that had always been theirs. On June 27, 1874, as the sun crested over the horizon, Quanah Parker led nearly 700 warriors from the Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne onto the open plains toward Adobe Walls. It should have been a slaughter. Their numbers were overwhelming, 40-1 against a mere 28 buffalo hunters, holed up in a settlement of just a few wooden buildings. It was supposed to be a swift, crushing victory, a reckoning for the destruction of the buffalo herds and the slow death of their way of life. But the moment of surprise was lost before the first shot was fired. The hunters were already awake. The earth itself had betrayed the warriors. Just before dawn, a mysterious cracking sound, later blamed on the timber foundation shifting beneath one of the buildings, had startled the hunters awake. When the attack came, they were ready. From his vantage point inside the settlement, Billy Dixon, a buffalo hunter with a rifle made for killing at impossible distances, watched in awe as hundreds of warriors stormed forward. Years later, he would recall the sight as terrifying yet magnificent. The flower of the Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne riding their finest horses, adorned in war paint and regalia, shields of thick buffalo hide gleaming under the rising sun. The air shimmered with the rich colors of red, vermilion, and ochre painted onto warriors and their mounts alike. Scalps dangled from bridles, war bonnets danced in the wind, and silver and brass ornaments flashed like fire against the bronze skin of the riders. It was a vision of power, of resistance, of a people fighting against the tide of destruction that was sweeping across their world. By all logic, it should have been over in minutes. But this was not a battle fought on the open plains, where speed and surprise reigned supreme. The Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne were warriors of movement, masters of the raid, of striking fast and vanishing before the enemy could respond. But here the enemy did not have to move. They had walls, doors, and the brutal efficiency of long-range buffalo rifles, weapons designed to drop a bison from hundreds of yards away. Against them, even the fastest horse, the strongest warrior, could do nothing. The warriors fought bravely, pressing forward, closing the distance, but the walls held. Each time they advanced, the heavy-caliber rifles cut them down. The fight turned into something unfamiliar, something unnatural. This was not the kind of war they had been born to fight. As the battle stretched into days, frustration turned to doubt. Isatai, the medicine man who had promised them victory, refused to come near the rifle fire. He had claimed the warriors would be protected, that no bullet would harm them, but he remained far from the range of the hunters' guns. Some began to wonder, did he not believe in his own puha? Then on the third day the impossible happened. Billy Dixon took aim at a distant warrior, 1,500 yards away, nearly a mile. He fired, and a Comanche warrior fell from his horse. It was an impossible shot, a stroke of either divine luck or cold precision, and it shattered the last hope of turning the battle. Even Quanah Parker, the fiercest of them all, was wounded, not by a direct shot, but by a ricochet, as if the land itself was working against them. The fight had gone on too long. The warriors had come to destroy the buffalo hunters, but instead they had been forced to fight on the enemy's terms, in a battle that had never been theirs to win. And so the decision was made. They would leave Adobe Walls behind, not defeated, but forced to wait for another day, another battle. But the world was changing, and there were fewer battles left to fight. The retreat was inevitable. Quanah Parker, the fiercest warrior of the Quahati Comanche, had been wounded, not by a direct shot, but by a ricochet, a stray bullet that seemed almost symbolic of the battle itself. The medicine had failed. The warriors had come to this fight, believing in their own invincibility, assured by Isatai's promises that bullets would not harm them, that the Great Spirit had willed them to victory. But now they saw the truth. The walls of Adobe Walls still stood. The buffalo hunters still lived. And the warriors, those who survived, had to turn away. Even if they had wanted to stay and fight, reinforcements were coming. The Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne had struck hard, but this was not their kind of war. They were not besiegers. They were raiders, warriors of movement, striking fast and vanishing like ghosts into the prairie winds. But here they had stayed too long, fought too long, bled too long. The longer they remained, the more they realized they were fighting on the enemy's terms. Isatai had given them hope, but in the end, hope was not enough. When warriors returned to their camps, angry and demoralized, Isatai needed someone to blame. He could not admit that his puha had failed, that the Great Spirit had not shielded them from bullets. And so he looked elsewhere. The Cheyenne, he claimed, had tainted his power by killing a skunk before battle. A single act, he insisted, had corrupted the medicine, had turned the spirits against them. Some may have believed him, but for many, the illusion had shattered. The faith he had built was crumbling, and with it, the last hope that the Comanche could win through spiritual power alone. No one knew the exact toll of the battle. It was estimated that 30 warriors had fallen, but as always, the true count was uncertain. Plains tribes never left their dead behind if they could help it. They carried them away, refusing to let their enemies claim their bodies as trophies, as proof of victory. But not all could be retrieved. 15 warriors were left in the field, too close to the buffalo hunters' rifles to be reached. Their spirits remained behind, trapped on a battlefield that was never meant to be theirs. But the greatest cost of the battle was not in lives lost. Adobe Walls set something far worse into motion. In Washington and in the forts along the frontier, the U.S. Army saw this for what it was, a final act of defiance, an excuse to bring the full weight of their forces down upon the last free tribes of the plains. Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie was given his orders: hunt them down, break them, end them. And so the Red River War began, the final war of the Comanche, the last stand of the free warriors of the southern plains. By 1874, only 3,000 Comanche remained, most concentrated in the Texas Panhandle, caught between two worlds. Some still roamed free, clinging to the ways of their ancestors, while others hovered near reservations, using them for shelter, for food, for survival. It was a delicate balance, but one the Army was ready to exploit. There would be no more places to hide, no more places to run. The strategy was simple and ruthless. Trap the Quahati, box them in, force them to surrender or destroy them where they stood. From the north, Colonel Nelson Miles, a man who would later carve his name into history, fighting the Apache, led his forces south from Fort Dodge. From the west and east, more detachments moved from Fort Sill and Fort Bascom, tightening the net. And from the south, the most relentless of them all, Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie, drove his men northward from Fort Concho, leading the largest force ever deployed against the Comanche. For the first time, the Army was not chasing shadows. This was not a campaign of pursuit. It was a campaign of entrapment. The Comanche, the greatest raiders the plains had ever seen, were being hunted like bison, herded into a corner where they would be forced to fight on terms they had never wanted. The Americans had learned from past failures. This time, they would not stop until the job was done. They built permanent supply bases, ensuring that for every bullet fired, another would be waiting. Their soldiers had warm clothes, endless provisions, and fresh horses. The Comanche had none of these luxuries. They had their families to protect, their elders, their children, their way of life hanging in the balance. And with each passing day, the noose tightened. 4 to 5 months, the U.S. Army patrolled the plains, moving like an unrelenting storm. The Comanche fought as they always had, striking fast, disappearing into the land. But this time there was no safety, no sanctuary, no open plains left to vanish into. This was not a single battle. It was a slow, grinding war of attrition. And for the first time, the Comanche were running out of time. For months, Ranald S. Mackenzie had hunted the last free Comanche warriors, waiting for the moment when they would be most vulnerable. That moment came on September 25, 1874. Word had reached the army of a large Comanche village deep in Palo Duro Canyon, hidden in the rugged heart of the Texas Panhandle. It was not just a camp. It was a lifeline, filled with food, supplies, and everything the Comanche needed to survive the coming winter. If Mackenzie could take it, he wouldn't just win a battle, he would take away their ability to fight at all. He moved with 600 soldiers of the 4th Cavalry, hardened men who had spent months in the saddle, alongside 32 Tonkawa scouts, enemies of the Comanche, eager to track their old rivals through the canyons. The journey was brutal. The land itself fought against them. But Mackenzie had learned from his past failures. This time, there would be no mistakes. At Blanco Canyon and North Fork, the Comanche had outmaneuvered him, striking at night, stealing horses, vanishing into the darkness. But Mackenzie was ready. He didn't just guard the horses. He had his men tie their legs together, ensuring they couldn't be stampeded or stolen. And just as expected, the Comanche attacked in the night, but this time, they failed. Their greatest weapon, the ability to move fast and strike without warning, had been neutralized. By morning, they had no choice but to disappear into the canyon. Now, Mackenzie turned to his final objective. He ordered his men to prepare for a grueling 12-day march, determined to track down the village. He was close, he could feel it. But he wanted certainty. He found it through torture. A Comanchero trader, one of the few outsiders who knew the location of Comanche strongholds, was stretched on a wagon wheel until he broke. He revealed the village's location, and the Tonkawa scouts confirmed it. With that, Mackenzie pushed his men forward at a relentless pace, and on September 28, 1874, they arrived. The Comanche had no idea they were coming. A Kiowa chief had assured them that no attack would reach this deep into Comancheria. They believed they were safe. They slept late, their horses grazing lazily in the valley. There were no sentries, no lookouts, no warning. Mackenzie and his men descended into the canyon through a narrow pass, slipping into position unseen. By the time the first shots rang out, it was already too late. The Comanche fought desperately, not to win, but to buy time. Their warriors rose up from behind the rocks, from the cedars, from the very earth itself. They struck from every direction, at first by dozens, then by hundreds, unleashing a furious resistance to cover the escape of their families. Sergeant John Charlton later wrote, "They attacked us from every quarter, first by dozens, later by hundreds. Many were concealed behind rocks, while others were ambushed in the foliage of cedars." The warriors held their ground for a time, fighting desperately to cover the exit of their squaws and pack animals. But under the persistent fire of the troops, they soon began falling back. The warriors fought with everything they had, but the battle had already been decided before it even began. This was not a fight between equals. This was an ambush on a sleeping village, an army against a people who thought they were safe. The Comanche had spent centuries ruling these lands, but in the span of a few bloody hours, their world came crashing down. The village was gone. Surprised, outnumbered, and outgunned, the Comanche had no choice but to flee, abandoning not just their homes, but everything they had gathered to survive the brutal winter ahead. The soldiers found the remains of a once thriving camp. Stacks of buffalo robes, dried meat, flour, ammunition, weapons, cooking kettles, even army blankets taken from reservations. These were not just supplies, they were lifelines. Much of these supplies had come from the reservations. It was a cruel irony. The very system that had been meant to assimilate them had also been a source of survival for those who refused to surrender. Now it was all in flames. Some of Mackenzie's men pursued the fleeing warriors, tracking them for 4 miles before killing 4 more Comanche and returning to the main force. But Mackenzie was not satisfied with simply chasing them away. He wasn't just fighting warriors, he was destroying a civilization. Mackenzie ordered the village to be burned. Bonfires roared to life, consuming everything. Hundreds of lodges, stacks of buffalo meat, supplies meant to last through the long winter. Thick smoke curled into the sky, carrying with it the scent of burning flour and sugar, the last remnants of what had once been a home. By 3 o'clock his men climbed back out of the canyon. But they weren't leaving empty-handed. They took 1,424 horses with them. Comanche warriors had lost battles before, but never like this. The last time the Comanche had been forced to abandon their horses, they had always found a way to reclaim them. Mackenzie would not make that mistake again. He gave the order, "Kill them, all of them." The soldiers executed over 1,000 horses, leaving their bodies in massive piles, bleaching under the sun, a grim monument to the battle. Only a few were spared, given to Tonkawa scouts and officers. The Comanche didn't just lose their mounts, they lost their spirit. With no food, no shelter, and no way to move, they had been left with nothing. This wasn't just the burning of a village. It was the burning of a way of life. Mackenzie had done what no one before him had managed. Palo Duro Canyon was not just another battle. It was the death knell of the Comanche as a free people. The war was over, the lodges were gone, the horses were dead, and the last food stores had been burned to ash. There was nothing left to fight for, only the long walk to surrender. Mackenzie had broken the Comanche. News spread across the plains that even the most defiant bands were giving up. By February 1875, Lone Wolf's Kiowa came in. In March, nearly 1,000 Southern Cheyenne followed. The resistance that had once shaken the frontier was fading into history. But one band still held out, the last free Comanche. Only 400 remained, maybe 100 warriors, still wandering the high plains, clinging to the last vestiges of a vanishing world. They were the Quahati, led by Quanah Parker, and they would not surrender easily. Mackenzie knew they wouldn't last forever. The buffalo were nearly gone. The winter had been cruel. The war had left them with nothing. Instead of sending soldiers, he sent words. He chose diplomacy. He sent Wild Horse, a Comanche chief who had already surrendered, along with a small party, to find Quanah and convince him that the fight was over. They found them starving, battered by the cold, their numbers shrinking with each passing day. They were warriors without a war, a people without a homeland. For 2 days, They held council, debating what was left to be done. Quanah did not decide lightly. Before he made his choice, he sought guidance from the Great Spirit. He had a vision. He saw a wolf howling at him before running toward Fort Sill. Then an eagle swooped down and flew in the same direction. To Quanah, this was the sign he needed. He had done all he could, led his people as far as they could go. It was time. All he asked was to be allowed to hunt on the journey there. One last moment of freedom before the inevitable. And so in May 1875, Quanah and his band of Quahati began their final journey. As they moved across the plains, they tried to hold on to the last pieces of the life they once knew, but the world around them had changed. The great buffalo herds had been wiped out. The land that had once been theirs now belonged to another people. They were walking not just toward Fort Sill, but toward the end of an era. On June 2, 1875, Quanah Parker and the last free Comanche arrived at Fort Sill. Mackenzie was there to meet them. The war was over, and with it, so was the age of the Comanche.